The image of a medieval castle in film is iconic. High stone walls rising into the mist, siege towers rattling forward, archers loosing arrows in unison, boiling oil poured from crenellations. It feels dramatic, heroic, deeply cinematic. But in the real Middle Ages, actual castle defense looked quite different. Far more calculated, layered, and less glamorous than the Hollywood version. What we're going to explore today is how medieval castles were actually defended, the techniques, the architecture, the psychology behind it, and why many classic assumptions about castle warfare are oversimplified. First, every castle was built with the assumption that it would be under siege for weeks or months, not hours. The emphasis was on delay, attrition, and protection more than flashy last-stand charges. Most attackers preferred forcing a surrender or starving defenders out rather than storming a fortress head-on. That meant castles had to buy time, repel initial assaults, and survive until relief or negotiations. One core principle is layering. Natural terrain, outer defenses, inner defenses, keep, then escape or relief routes. At each layer, the defenders sought to inflict maximum cost on attackers, while preserving their own strength. Location was critical. Castles were rarely plonked down randomly. They were placed on high ground, cliffs, islands, river bends, or rocky outcrops precisely because the terrain itself became part of the defense. As one historian summarized, nature could provide very effective defenses for the castle. So before any arrow was loosed or drawbridge raised, the site itself already made life harder for attackers. Once location was chosen, the architecture followed. The curtain wall, the primary external wall surrounding the castle, was built to be massively thick, often several meters of stone and rubble, to resist battering rams and missile fire. Double walls or concentric designs became favored in the 13th and 14th centuries, a castle within a castle. The outer wall might break, but the inner wall still stood. Such designs created attacking funnels, exposed attackers in multiple zones, and maximize defender advantage. Let's walk through a typical gatehouse assault scenario because the gate was always the weakest point, and therefore the scene of the fiercest work. Approaching armies had to cross a moat or ditch, often water-filled but sometimes dry, then face a drawbridge or turning bridge, then an outer gate, then the barbican or outer fortification, then the main gatehouse tunnel equipped with portcullis, heavy wooden doors, arrow slits, murder holes in the ceiling. The arrow loops allowed defenders to fire from cover. Murder holes allowed objects, hot coals, boiling water, or sand to be dropped onto attackers trapped inside the gate tunnel. Attackers reaching this zone were trapped between doors and portcullis, a kill zone. Beyond the gate, once attackers breached the outer wall, the bailey opened, a tactical empty space. While film often uses the bailey for feasts or tournaments, in war it was deadly. Attackers inside the bailey were exposed to fire from inner walls, towers, and murder holes. Again, defenders were extending the attack path, forcing the enemy through layers of fire. The defenders rarely sallied out. They stayed behind walls, protected, forcing attackers to do the work. Towers played a key role. The move from square towers to round ones is not just aesthetic, it reflects tactical improvement. Round towers eliminated blind spots, deflected missile impact better, and allowed overlapping fields of fire. Inside towers, you often found spiral staircases turning clockwise, favoring right-handed defenders swinging swords downwards, while attackers ascending were disadvantaged. Arrow slits in walls and towers were narrow vertical apertures, allowing defenders wide fields of fire, but offering attackers minimal targets. These seemingly simple details reveal just how sophisticated castle defense really was. Then there's the roof zone: battlements, crenellations, arrow loops, hoardings, machicolations. Wooden hoardings projected from the wall, enabling defenders to drop projectiles straight below. Machicolations were permanent stone equivalents, holes between corbels through which hot liquids, stones, or burning logs could be dumped directly onto attackers at the wall base. These allowed defenders to use gravity and height to huge effect. One myth that persists is boiling oil poured from battlements. In reality, oil was expensive and rare. More commonly, defenders used boiling water or sand, stones, logs, debris. The focus was on making the approach as costly and slow as possible. For example, moats prevented battering rams from even reaching the wall, and water made undermining tunnels harder. Dry moats still slowed progress, forced attackers into narrow paths or exposed positions. Another defense, the barbican, a fortified outpost protecting the main gate. By the time attackers reached the barbican, they were under fire and facing yet another obstacle before the main gate. Let's not ignore the temporal defense. Supply, endurance, relief. A castle might withstand weeks of assault provided it had water, food, ammunition, morale. Long sieges often ended not by storm, but by starvation, disease, or negotiated surrender. So many castles included wells, storage, even hidden escape tunnels or sally ports, so defenders could sneak out and attack the besiegers' camp. The idea wasn't always hold forever, but hold long enough until help arrives or attackers give up. With the arrival of gunpowder and cannons in the 14th to 15th centuries, castles changed again. Tall, thin walls became liabilities. Artillery favored lower, thicker bastions, angled walls, new tower shapes to mount cannon themselves. But the era of purely medieval castles still dominated for hundreds of years thanks to the defensive depth they offered. One example that illustrates all this is Dover Castle in England. Digital reconstructions show how the layered defenses, ditch, barbican, twin-towered gatehouse, outer bailey, and inner keep all work together to buy time and repel a determined assault. When attackers found themselves funneled into narrow approaches under overlapping fire, the architecture forced them into positions where the defenders had the advantage. But what about the film version of castle defense? The heroic knight charging up the ladder, lighting the siege tower on fire, vaulting into the gate. The true story was more pragmatic. Archers, crossbows, defending high ground, controlling resources, limiting enemy movement, rationing food, delaying assaults, repairing breaches. Many defenders didn't even leave their rooms. They manned walls, watched approaches, kept supplies while the attackers got worn down. Even when storms and breaches occurred, defenders had further fallbacks. Wall walks behind inner curtain walls, keeps, strong inner towers that served as last stand points, hidden passages allowing nobles or critical personnel to escape. Symbolism aside, defense was methodical, repetitive, exhausting, and for many months. That doesn't mean there were no dramatic moments, but those were exceptions, not the norm. History remembers storming of castles, but siege warfare was often a waiting game. Attackers hoped for a quick breach. Defenders hoped to outlast them. Every part of a castle's design reflects that strategy. Moats, angled towers, arrow loops, murder holes, keep cores, layered walls, sally ports, all built to make conquest costly. When you visit a medieval castle today, look beyond the picturesque. Look for the ditch, the angled approach, the short wall walk behind a higher wall, the inner keep set away from the outer defenses. These are clues to how the architects expected the war to unfold. As one guide puts it, almost all parts of a castle serve a defensive purpose and help create multiple layers of protection. As we continue deeper into how medieval castles were actually defended, it's important to highlight something many people overlook: the psychological dimension of siege warfare. A siege wasn't merely a physical confrontation between attackers and walls. It was a battle of endurance, nerve, morale, and perception. The very sight of a massive stone fortress towering above a landscape was enough to deter most small armies from even trying to attack. Many lords built castles not just as defensive structures, but as symbols of power meant to intimidate enemies and reassure their subjects. If a castle looked impenetrable, it often didn't have to fight at all. Its mere existence maintained stability. Defenders understood this psychological edge and amplified it. Banners flew high, trumpets sounded, guards patrolled visibly along the battlements. Even when supplies were low or the garrison was small, they projected confidence to make attackers unsure. A besieging army often faced uncertainty about how many defenders were inside, how much food they had, whether reinforcements were coming. This uncertainty could be enough to discourage a long siege. Meanwhile, defenders deliberately avoided revealing weaknesses. If part of the wall was weakened by siege engines, repairs happened at night. If morale dipped, priests, musicians, or leaders made speeches or held ceremonies to maintain belief and cohesion. Attackers, meanwhile, faced their own psychological burdens. Staying outside a fortified structure for months meant dealing with weather, sickness, boredom, desertion, and the looming fear that a relief army could appear at any moment and trap them between castle walls and an enemy force. This looming threat made besiegers particularly cautious. They had to keep scouts out constantly, build counter-fortifications, and ensure they weren't surprised. Defenders exploited this by launching small but strategic night raids, not to destroy the besieging camp, but to keep attackers awake, anxious, and less coordinated. A castle that fought psychologically was just as effective as one that fought physically. Another overlooked aspect of real medieval defense was the constant labor of reinforcing, repairing, and adapting the castle throughout the siege. Unlike movie scenes where defenders simply stand on walls firing arrows, real defenders spent long days hauling stones, boiling water, sharpening stakes, reinforcing breaches, and maintaining the structure under bombardment. Siege warfare was labor-intensive. If siege engines like trebuchets or mangonels struck a wall repeatedly, defenders rushed to fill cracks with rubble, timber braces, or earth. Earth surprisingly absorbed shock better than stone, so defenders often packed breached areas with dirt to prevent collapse. Water systems were equally important. A castle needed a reliable source, a well, spring, or cistern. Attackers knew this, so they sometimes attempted to poison rivers, block streams, or dig trenches to divert water. Defenders responded by building hidden wells or creating complex underground channels. Some castles had cisterns carved into bedrock or hidden behind the keep, filled during winter or rain seasons, and sealed for use only during siege. Without water, no garrison could last long, so securing it was central to castle design. Food stores were just as critical. Granaries, salted meat barrels, dried vegetables, preserved grains, all stored in cool, protected chambers deep inside the keep. Lords often gathered extra supplies during times of peace specifically to prepare for possible multi-year sieges. Attackers sometimes tried to starve a castle out by burning fields and stripping the countryside, but well-prepared castles could last months or even years. Some famous sieges lasted over 5 years, which reveals how organized and disciplined the medieval defenders could be. Hollywood rarely portrays this slow, grinding struggle, but it was the core reality of castle defense. Communication inside the castle was another aspect that mattered immensely. Large castles had intricate signaling systems, horn calls, drum beats, flags, torch codes, all used to convey orders instantly across walls, towers, and inner yards. If attackers tried a diversionary assault on one gate while preparing a real breach elsewhere, defenders needed to know this immediately. Good communication enabled quick unit movement, coordinated archery volleys, and rapid reinforcement of threatened zones. In this way, a castle was more like a living organism. Every part needed to be aware of the other's status to survive. Let's also consider the role of specialists. A castle wasn't defended only by soldiers. There were engineers who understood angles, weight distribution, counterweights for portcullises, and repair techniques. Blacksmiths worked non-stop forging arrowheads, repairing armor, fixing hinges, or crafting anti-siege tools like wall hooks or chains. Cooks rationed food carefully to ensure long-term survival. Medics or herbalists tended to wounded archers and soldiers, preventing infection from spreading and keeping the fighting force ready. Even monks played key roles, not only spiritually but as literate record keepers who could organize inventory, assist with logistics, and sometimes even help coordinate strategies. Another fascinating but rarely shown aspect is how defenders manipulated the environment. Some castles had systems to flood surrounding fields intentionally, turning flat land into swamps that trapped siege towers or slowed cavalry charges. Others had false paths, dead-end tunnels or hidden pits intended to confuse attackers once they breached the outer defenses. Some castles were built near cliffs with intentionally loose debris. When attackers tried to climb, defenders triggered collapses that sent rocks tumbling down. Inside the castle, defenders had fallback zones prepared for the worst-case scenario. If the enemy breached the outer walls, defenders retreated to the inner bailey, then to the keep. Each fallback point had pre-stocked weapons, barricades, and supplies. The keep, the final strong point, was often intentionally windowless on lower levels, making it incredibly hard to assault. Defenders stored the best archers and fighters inside and could hold out even when the rest of the castle was lost. Sometimes negotiations took place here, with the keep's defenders using their advantage to demand honorable surrender terms. But peppered within all these details is one truth. Most sieges ended without full-scale battles. Attackers often gave up due to weather or disease. Defenders sometimes negotiated surrender when supplies ran out. Other times, castles fell due to betrayal. A guard bribed to open the postern gate, or a spy who revealed a hidden weakness. Bribery and politics were as much a part of castle warfare as arrows in boiling water. The most famous fortresses in history sometimes fell not because of superior force, but because of internal treachery. And we can't ignore that across centuries, castle architecture adapted constantly in response to new offensive technology. As siege towers grew taller, walls grew higher or steeper. As miners improved at tunneling, castle foundations deepened or gained countermining tunnels. As trebuchets appeared, walls became thicker and more rounded. When cannons arrived, castles evolved into star-shaped fortresses with angled bastions. The medieval castle was never static. It was part of an ongoing arms race between defense and offense. All of this ultimately shows that medieval castle defense was far more advanced, strategic, and nuanced than movie scenes suggest. It was a slow, survival-oriented system designed not to produce glorious battlefield moments, but to grind enemy morale down and force attrition. The walls were not just stone, they were time, patience, planning, and enormous human effort carved into architecture. Even today, standing inside a medieval castle and seeing the thick walls, narrow staircases, confusing hallways, deep wells, and interlocking defensive lines gives you a sense of how intelligently these structures were crafted. Every stone had purpose. Every angle had intent. Every chamber served a defensive or logistical function. And in many cases, these castles survived hundreds of years of warfare, a testament to their brilliance. In summary, castles weren't just glorious residences for lords and ladies. They were fortified systems designed for attrition, vantage, resource retention, and ruthless defense. The movies show the hero moment. Real defenders lived the months-long grind of siege, maintenance, watch duty, rationing, and hope. The difference between myth and reality is vast, but understanding that difference reveals how brilliant and effective medieval castle design actually was. If you enjoyed this deep dive into castle defense, keep an eye out for more videos where we'll explore siege engines, castle life during siege, and how the arrival of gunpowder changed everything.